The services sector is important for Australia in two different ways. The first part of our services sector is what is known as the export services sector. They are services that we can actually sell to people from overseas. And so in the same way we export iron ore, we export tourism and we export education, and actually we export the professional services part of the health industry. The second part of the services sector is the population-driven services sector. So that's when we visit the supermarket and we go to the checkout and a person behind serves us. That's a population-driven service. Now, the population-driven services provide good jobs, but they're not particularly highly paid jobs, and they don't have significant economic multipliers associated with them. Whereas an export job, for example, international tourism, has very significant economic multipliers. And so for every single job that services an international traveller, a minimum of 2 jobs in Australia, 2 more jobs is generated, and up to 3 jobs. So in looking at the services sectors that are important to Australia, I've focused on the export services, of which not a lot is known, and of which Australia is relatively competitive, yet very immature in delivery. And so tourism is a great example of that, where we think our tourism industries are fantastic. Well, I can tell you they're not. If we looked at our international tourism performance, for example, and we compared it to Singapore or KL, you would find that our international tourism is around 1/3 the level of their international tourism today. If you looked at the quality of our airports, you would see that a flight from KLIA, Kuala Lumpur International, into Melbourne Airport would demonstrate which is the third world country. Of course, it's Australia, it's not Kuala Lumpur. But what we're finding is significant increases in our international tourism, significant increases in airline movements, and we're in a situation where we could double the amount of international tourism in Australia in the next 7 years. And in fact, in my book, I'm forecasting that provided the hotel rooms can be delivered, and in Melbourne they are being delivered, not so much in Sydney yet, but I think they will, we could get 7% compounding growth over a 10-year time frame, which would give us around about 100% increase in the international tourism industry. That's a fantastic outcome and a fantastic result. But the rub in this is that, of course, we don't plan cities for tourism. So you can come to Melbourne and you can leave the plane, and you think you're going to get a train into the city, but of course there are no trains. You then walk and you think you'll get a bus, but there's no bus. You then go to the taxi stand and there's 500 people waiting in line for a taxi, and that's just the beginning of a space odyssey of errors, mistakes, and relatively low levels of service in Australia compared to the international outcome. And yet we still remain competitive because we have a great nature-based product in Australia. So the book makes a case, for example, for developing spatial tourism plans. And a good example of that would be if we took the harbour in Sydney, or if we took the Yarra in Melbourne, that we would create special walking trips, trails, events, ideas which move along the length. Not just walk to the Opera House, look around and then walk back, and not just perhaps walk to the Melbourne Arts Centre and maybe walk up 400 metres to the Yarra and then walk back to the CBD. We need to improve our depth, we need to improve insight, we need to expose the beautiful cultures that we've got in terms of Indigenous and nature-based tourism, as well as the fact that, for example, that Melbourne is one of the top 10 most authentic Victorian cities in the world. But we're not there yet. So the book is very much understanding export services as a key to Australia's future.